Good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Ferrer, Executive Director of the American Philosophical Association. Welcome to this special public session, part of the 2025 APA Central Division meeting. This virtual meeting is the first in the APA's experiment with a rotation of online and in-person conferences over the next 3 years. So thank you so much for attending tonight's event and for being a part of this meeting. Tonight's event is titled Thinking Together, Philosophy and Civic Life, and the APA is grateful to the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress for co-sponsoring this session in honor of 2024 Kluge Prize winner Kwame Antini Appiah. Appiah has a long history with the APA, including as past president of the APA Eastern Division and as a past board chair, so we're especially honored to celebrate his Kluge Prize tonight. Many thanks to the panelists for this discussion, Antini Appiah, Jennifer Morton, and Regina Rini, as well as moderator and APA board chair R. Lanier Anderson for participating in the event. The event is being recorded, and a recording will be made available shortly after the conclusion of the APA Central Division meeting next week for the benefit of those who can't attend live. During the conversation, feel free to submit questions via the chat function in Zoom, and moderator Lanier Anderson will pose selected questions to the panelists during their conversation. Finally, before we begin, I want to take a moment to note that the APA is celebrating several milestone anniversaries this year, including the 125th anniversary of the founding of the association and of the Central Division, and more anniversaries over the next 2 years. We're marking these milestones with our Wiser Together anniversary campaign, and we hope you'll consider supporting the APA by becoming a member or making a donation toward the campaign. Your contribution will help secure the future of the APA and ensure the association can continue to serve the next generation of philosophers. You can make a donation on the APA website, apaonline.org/donate. So thanks very much. And now to share more about the Kluge Prize, I'll turn things over to Dan Torello of the Kluge Center. Dan.
Thank you, Amy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Torello, and I manage the Kluge Prize for the Library of Congress. We're absolutely thrilled to be partnering with the American Philosophical Association on this event. The Kluge Center has been around for 25 years, and it was created thanks to a generous gift from John W. Kluge. It was established within the Library of Congress as part of the Library of Congress with the explicit intention of creating meaningful conversations between scholars and those involved in policymaking. If you're not yet familiar with the Kluge Center, I hope you'll take a few minutes in the next few days to take a look at our website. And in particular, if you're early in your career, perhaps you're a postdoctoral scholar or an assistant professor, our Kluge Fellowship is our flagship fellowship. We take in a new cohort of scholars every year. Those applications are due on September 15, so you have plenty of time to look it over and make your plans and perhaps submit an application this year if you so wish. Over the course of the Kluge Center's history, the Kluge Prize itself, and the prize is different from the fellowships, and I'll say a little bit about the prize in a moment, but the Kluge Prize itself has been awarded to a number of distinguished philosophers. The Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski received the first Kluge Prize in 2003. He was followed by Paul Ricoeur. Later on in 2015, Jürgen Habermas and Charles Taylor shared the award. And of course, the most recent prize in 2024 went to Kwame Anthony Appiah. The prize is a major international award. It is given on the basis of 3 criteria, and those are intellectual achievement, first and foremost, impact on public affairs and civil society, and the prize winner's ability to communicate the significance of their work to broad audiences. So the subject matter for this evening's panel, as you already heard from Amy, is Thinking Together, Philosophy and Civic Life, and that reflects those 3 areas of emphasis of the prize. And it's part of several events under the rubric of Thinking Together, and that's the overall programming theme that we chose along with Anthony. Let me again say how pleased we are to be co-sponsoring this event with the APA. I want to thank Amy for suggesting the idea, and of course Lanier Anderson for moderating, and Anthony, Jennifer, and Regina for making the time to be with us this evening. So thank you all, and Lanier, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dan. Welcome everyone to the special public session celebrating the Kluge Prize winner, Kwame Anthony Appiah. As you've just heard, the program today will involve a conversation about philosophy and civic life. My name is Lanier Anderson of Stanford University. I'm the chair of the APA Board of Officers. and I'll serve as today's host. Our first discussant for the conversation is, of course, K. Anthony Appiah, Professor of Philosophy and Law at New York University, and the recipient of the 2024 John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity. Joining Professor Appiah on the panel, we are also lucky to have Professor Jennifer Morton, the Penn Compact Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, and Regina Rini, the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Moral and Social Cognition at York University in Toronto. Thank you so much, Anthony, Jen, and Gina, for joining us today for this exciting and timely conversation. So let me just open us up with a broad question about our role as philosophers. As Anthony pointed out in our pre-meeting to discuss the panel, philosophers have a lot to say to each other about a very wide range of topics, from the highly technical to the universally existential. And the first question really is, which things among our overall set of concerns is it important for us as philosophers to try to inject into the public discourse and find a broader civic voice for? And why should we pick those things? So maybe, Anthony, you could start us out, and then the panel can chime in.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the APA and the Kluge Center and to my two colleagues. Well, I guess my feeling about what we should talk about is whatever we think needs talking about. And that varies, obviously over time and place and also opportunities. I mean, I think it's obvious that philosophers have interesting things to say about civic life itself. And therefore in civic life to people. But, one of the most important things I think I feel that I teach my students and that should be more widely appreciated in our public life, for example, is actually an epistemological point, a point that comes from reflection on what we know and how we know it, which is that I think modern people are inclined to think that knowledge is easier than it is. And they're therefore more likely to claim knowledge than they're entitled to, and to be sort of confident in their opinions. And it's like the problem that doctors now have, right? Which is that they're always competing with somebody called Dr. Google. The patient comes in convinced that all the doctor is there for is to write the prescription. Actually, there are things that doctors know as a result of training that it's very hard to learn and solve just by noodling around. And the same is true, I think, about many of the kinds of knowledge that are needed to manage our lives together. So I'd say, of course, we should think about justice and fairness and the sort of the virtues and vices of civic life. But I think it's important to see that we have other things that it's useful to say as well.
Gina, Jen, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think I'll start small. Walking around Philadelphia, it's funny, sometimes I'll see these signs on light posts that are like reading group on Du Bois or like philosophy. You just see this, I think, thirst out there. And so I think our first job in entering public life and civic life is to just listen to what people want to be talking about. And I think if you're like paying attention, you notice that these philosophical conversations are happening all over the place, and very smart, not just like the kind of places we think of as the places where public intellectuals are having these conversations, but really, like at Penn, we have students who go out and teach philosophy or talk in philosophy at the local schools, at the prisons. Like there are so many places where people want to be having philosophical conversations. And so I kind of think about one of our tasks as philosophers, if we want to enter these conversations, it's really listening and being really aware of public discourse, of what people are interested in talking about, and then thinking, how can a philosopher enter this conversation? So in my own work, I've done that a lot with thinking about the social sciences. I read a lot in the social sciences. I'm thinking about debates in education or thinking about work. And then there are always these places where I think people stop short of having the conversation, say about values or about political organization, because they feel not well equipped to have that conversation. I think that's where you can hopefully enter and have some tools to help people talk about the questions they really want to be talking about, and they're talking about. And it's just helpful to have someone with our expertise come in and offer some tools, some concepts. So that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, I'd add one thing. I mean, I agree with so much that's been said already, but I add one thing I think about a lot, which is that we have a particular responsibility to help people see a connection between the present day, the concerns of living in interesting times, and the long train of thought. And not everybody's a historian of philosophy. I'm not a historian of philosophy, but all of us have probably more background with historical philosophers than most people do. And so to the extent that we can help people see that some of the concerns that seem so unexpected and taxing today are concerns that people have always had in different ways, I think is actually helpful. Like I've talked to people who find it reassuring that some of the things that bother them are some of the same things that bothered Kant or Zhuangzi or somebody. There's somebody in the past. And so I think we have an opportunity and a responsibility, perhaps, as part of public engagement to be a kind of temporal bridge connecting people to earlier thinkers.
I think that's a very important point, because it's one of the things I think that marks us as, I mean, philosophers do lots of things, and we connect with the sciences and with the social sciences and with the arts and so on. But one of the things we do, I think, is we're humanists, many of us, and humanists are people who think that we live in a long conversation, and that one should be connected with the earlier conversation and pass things on to the conversation that will come after us. I mean, I think, and particularly when in moments when people are, I think, anxious and therefore inclined to sort of be unhistorical and to think, oh, this has never happened before, or there's nothing in the past to help us. I think it's good to remind people that it's not that there's nothing new under the sun, but it is that in our business, we've discovered that continuing that conversation backwards turns out to be helpful in thinking about things now. And that's true not just of the sort of technical philosophical things, but of the more broadly philosophical enterprise.
Yeah, it really broadens out our perspective. So that historical depth is a kind of expertise that we bring into the conversation, and we bring a lot of other kinds of expertise, the kinds of concepts and tools that Jen was talking about, but also the observation that Anthony started with, that knowledge is actually harder than people think. And those are all forms of expertise that we bring into the conversation. But insofar as we're doing that, maybe it's also important to reflect on how we wear that expertise in the conversation and what it takes to maintain a suitable humility as we enter these conversations, so that the kind of listening that Jen was talking about can really happen. So do you guys have any advice or reflections for philosophers about how to make that balance?
I mean, I don't know if it's sort of my turn in the cycle, but I think for me, the most important thing is that you're not telling people what to think. You're trying to provide them with instruments to do their own thinking. And as Jen said, you can't really do that if you don't know anything about them. So you have to listen and try and think what in my bag of tricks might be helpful for whatever it is we're trying to think about here together. So I mean, it's very difficult to maintain a balance between legitimately claiming expertise because you've spent your time developing it, and it's tested against the standards of a profession that criticizes you when you make your mistakes, with being respectful for people and recognizing that that knowing the things I know doesn't make me more important than anybody else or better than anybody else, and that therefore I owe them respect, including intellectual respect, even if they're having a hard time because they don't have some of the tools that I have. And you know, one of the things philosophers, we try to teach this. I'm not sure we all are very good at practicing it, but we try to teach that you have to make the best of the other person's arguments. You have to you have not only to have a view, but you have to think about the views that contest your view. What is in that? And that's if you practice that, then it's helpful when you're talking to people who are less sort of technically adroit, because you can actually elicit from them, as it were, a clearer statement of what you think they're worried about, and then get them to agree with it or not. And I think that's a trick. That's a skill you learn by engaging with philosophers both from the present and from the past.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. I kind of take that same attitude that I have towards teaching, which is that if I walk into the classroom thinking I'm the expert and I have something to teach them, and the students just are these vessels, like I've lost the game. I'm actually not teaching. I think you have to walk in with curiosity about the students. I think you need to think that they could teach you something and really actually believe that you could learn something from them so that it's a reciprocal relationship. You have something to bring and they're going to surprise you and bring things up and tell you about, I don't know, what's going on in TikTok. I mean, that's just a silly example, but they just teach me so much about what people are thinking about, especially what people that age are thinking about. And so I think you have to bring that curiosity. And I think about that when I'm doing more public talks too, that I want to convey to the audience that I'm putting out some ideas out there and I'm hoping to learn from them. Walk away with something I've learned too, not just that they're supposed to get something from me. And I was just like the sage on the stage.
I'd add one thing, and I agree with everything that's been said, but I want to add one piece of practical advice for people who are considering or experimenting with reaching out to public audiences. Practically speaking, you will very quickly discover there is a check on your own humility, because you will get feedback from your readers or listeners or viewers or whatever. I've been writing a column for the last 5 years for the Times Literary Supplement. And every now and then there's a letter to the editor published in the TLS that's a response to my column. Sometimes people track down my university email address and send me a direct response to my column. I have to say that the TLS readership is fairly polite. I've published some op-eds in newspapers in the past, and those tend to lead to less polite emails. But the piece of advice, the practical advice here is for anybody who receives that kind of feedback, even the impolite kind, it's pretty much always useful data. Even if the person makes nonsense claims, does not understand the philosophy that they are shouting at you in all caps in the email for they think you misunderstood it and they don't understand it themselves because they just read about it in Wikipedia, even then that's data, because that tells you that you didn't communicate to a part of your readership something about what you were trying to communicate. And so I've found, as frustrating as it can be sometimes to get that kind of feedback, I try to think about it as the corrective, if not to the ideas I'm expressing, but how I'm communicating them.
So there's been a lot of talk already about the audience that we are trying to reach when we engage in broad civic discourse. And maybe I'd like to hear the three of you reflect on what the range of audiences is that we really ought to try to reach here. And on the other side, what kind of pre-thinking or even prior training we ought to engage in ourselves in order to do a better job of reaching those audiences.
I'm not going to start this time.
Jen, why don't you start this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always changes what the audience says, and I'm constantly thinking about that. So most of my public facing work has been on education, and in particular about first-gen low-income students. And so the audience is very well defined in some ways. there's a whole group of people in higher ed that think about first, not just people doing research, but people that actually support those students that work at the university to think what those students need and the students themselves. But then in other work, I think sometimes when we're talking about, say, politics or something like that, it does get, I think it is a question to ask yourself what the audience is. And it's not always clear to me. And what kind of training we need to do that. I think to some extent, like Gina and Anthony probably have much more to say than I do, but I do think it's my sense is like you just have to keep doing it and like really put yourself out there in a way that feels very painful. Like Gina was saying, you might get like really feedback that you don't want to get. And I remember talking to someone actually at Stanford last year in the anthropology department who does all this interesting public work about how she got started. And she said, this 1 year, she was like, I'm going to write up an op-ed every day and just send it out. And really just like, this is, I'm going to just teach myself how to do this. So many rejections, just do it over and over and over again. And in a way, we're familiar with doing that within the academic sphere, right? Like we understand the journal process and et cetera, and how much rejection that involves. But I think doing it to a public, that's harder, like figuring out where to get the feedback, that there is a lot of rejection. I think like within our profession, I think that seems to be like the hard part.
What about the part of the public that is putting the stickers on the light posts in Philadelphia about the Du Bois Reading Group? How do you find those people?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are all these like a civic society in Philadelphia, and I think cities, some cities have them. New York has them. I'm a member of one called the Athenaeum, and it's been around for like, I don't know, 200 years or something crazy like that, right? And so there are places, the Philadelphia Ethical Society, where I've given a talk too, where people are thinking and really have a thirst for intellectual engagement. And they're also like smaller reading groups. And the other day I was talking to someone that has a gallery and they have a reading group at their gallery. So you kind of sometimes just have to be out there listening and seeing where people are asking these questions. I think that is where like departments can be creative about meeting that need. And our department has a public philosophy, like a program. Our graduate students do this as part of their graduate education. They get a certificate in it. They teach at the schools. They run the, participate in the quiz bowl, all these different places to engage with people in the city. So I do think that departments can think about integrating that into graduate education in an interesting way if you're just like kind of paying attention to the need. Yeah.
Any more thoughts about this topic from our other panelists? Gina?
I would just add one thing about the connection between a broad audience and a teaching audience. So the venue of where you're writing or speaking or whatnot does matter a lot. You're reaching a much broader audience if you're going to be interviewed on Fox News or CNN than if you're writing for a literary journal. But what I use heuristically as a default target audience is an enthusiastic first-year student. So somebody who wants to be there, like don't think about the reluctant student who's taking the class because they have to take it. That nobody has to read a column or watch your interview. So they want to be there. They're interested to at least give you a starting point, but you can't assume any background. And so like thinking about that really motivated first year undergraduate student who doesn't know the jargon, but wants to hear what you have to say. That's my default audience in my head for most public engagement, and then modify that depending on what else you're doing. But I think that tends to work as a good target.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, there are so many places to interact with our fellow citizens. I mean, of course, the classroom is one, and you know, so I do this thing in the New York Times. Well, the magazine, I don't know how many people read it, perhaps 1 million or something. That's a lot, but that means that there are 329 million Americans who don't read it, and at least. So you're always speaking to a fraction of the potential public, and even you know, clearly you know, the typical reader of the New York Times Sunday magazine has a college degree. But I think one of the challenges in our society, where half the people don't go to college, is to continue engaging people who didn't. And they're sort of like if they want to be there, they're like the first year student. They don't know very much about about your thing, but they have lives and problems, and they know something. And your task is to listen to them in a way, or to know enough about them, if you can't listen to them directly, to think, what do I need to explain in order to get to where we're going? And also, what are they likely to want to know? What's sort of helpful for them? But that's very different. You know, I talk to kids in high schools. That's a different audience, because usually the teachers decided that I should come. It wasn't the students that decided, and so I have to try and persuade them that their teachers' desire that they should listen to me is reasonable. But sometimes, if you go to schools, you get parents as well, and they're also interested. So I think the main thing is the thing that Jen started with, which is sort of paying attention to what you can learn about your interlocutors. I'd say one other thing which connects with something she said, which is that you know, I only have a few well worked out things to say at any time, so I give the same talk more than once. That would be really boring if I wasn't learning something each time I gave it. I mean, you know, when I'm working it out, it's sort of interesting for me, but just saying it for the 7th time or the 10th time can't be interesting unless you anticipate what almost always happens, which is that somebody will say something that you hadn't thought of, or demonstrate to you in the way those emails to Gina do that you haven't communicated successfully, because they're asking you a question that you can't see the connection of to what you said or whatever. And that is a kind of practice. You just do that over and over again. You get a little bit better at anticipating what people won't get. And one thing I'd say about that is, even when you're trying to introduce people to a conceptual point, if you can, I think doing it through some kind of story, some kind of narrative, maybe from your own life, maybe from a fiction, a television program, or a movie they might have seen, or a novel they might have read. There's people still read novels in high school. I think that's you can make. I mean, it's important sometimes to make the conceptual point, but it'll sort of live in their minds if you connect it with somebody's doing something in some life.
Right.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that a little bit. People do, I think, have a thirst for having these conversations, and they're getting those conversations online, sometimes from YouTube or Reddit. So if you actually go into Reddit and look at different, you know, I've been really into like thinking about work recently, and there are all these Reddits about work, anti-work. People are having like really sophisticated philosophical conversations. They're not philosophers about like what the place should be of work in our society, you know. How much should you work? Should we have to work? All of these questions are happening, you know, discussions are happening there. So people are definitely having those conversations. And some people are people that work low income jobs. They're not, you know, like the kind of student that would go to Penn or Stanford or whatever, but they're having all of those conversations. I think not underestimating the kind of sophistication that lots of people across this country are having that don't read the New York Times and are not, you know, going to college or going to a fancy private school.
I mean, that
And-
is, these questions about work are, they have they have the thing that should make philosophers excited, because they're tremendously important for people's lives, but they're very challenging. I mean, they're intellectually extremely interesting, these questions about what's fair and unfair in the rewards of work, whether there are conditions of work that are just unacceptable, whatever you pay people, how much control managers should have over the people that work under them, and so on. All of these are intensely, people get fired for getting these things wrong. And yet thinking about what the right answer is actually very rewarding, because one learns things, I think, about, as it were, human well-being by thinking about them, and the place of sort of meaning in work, and how much the significance that one feels one's work has depends on having fed back to one an image of one's work as meaningful. And so it's not just a matter of making a judgment of your own, but you want, I guess that's part of what Rawls meant by the social bases of self-respect. You want to have an honoring image of yourself fed back to you if you're doing in what you're doing. And some things that I think people, so now I'm talking about the philosophy of work. So some things that people think, as it were, nobody could value doing. Actually, I'm not sure there is any such thing that anyone would want to pay anyone to do, because if you respect, if what you're doing is as it were worthwhile for somebody, then it's a lot of it is a question of whether the society, how the society represents it, and how the society thinks about it. If you're a Swedish garbage worker, you live in a society which understands that what you're doing is intensely important, because the society would fall apart without it, and you have uniforms provided for your job that reflect a sense of you as a professional person, and so on. And so you can think, I'm making a contribution, and you can think of yourself as if you're in a place that doesn't respect the people who collect our garbage, and I certainly grew up in such a place. I grew up in Ghana, where I don't think people have great respect for the people who make their lives possible in that way. Then, of course, it's hard for you to think of yourself as doing something worthwhile. Anyway, these seem to me very interesting questions, and what made us philosophers is not just that we have these questions, but we enjoy thinking about them. And that's another thing I think it's important to communicate, is that there are pleasures to be had in thinking about these things. Everybody already knows there's rewards to thinking about them, but recognizing that slightly upgrading the tools with which you think about them can be, which is what we can help with if we listen, is worthwhile.
Can I add one more thing about the work
yeah.
thing, which I think brings up an important, because I too have been thinking about work. One interesting thing about work is that it shows us the limitations we have as philosophers in virtue of our experiences in thinking about a really important institution. And that if we're professional philosophers, most of us have a very different kind of experience of work and at work than most other people. And then large swaths of the population. And so like your own kind of limitation, epistemic limitation, as it were, it's like right there on your face when you're start thinking about something like work. And I think that can be useful kind of example of how generative it can be to think with a public, not just like, at a public.
And that kind of reading that you're doing on Reddit is a classic example of learning from the experience of those other people about the way their work shows up to them to inform our own thinking about what to do. Let me broaden the aperture out a little bit back to the sort of larger historical scale that we had earlier in the conversation. So this is maybe like a somewhat bigger version of the same kind of question about the audience, but it really concerns the time scale at which we attempt to think and to write. So there are many philosophers from the tradition famously who at least pretended to write for eternity, as it were, and or at least to write for audiences that stretch out quite far into the future. But especially when we're talking about the kinds of contested social and political issues that are at the heart of civic life, our assumptions and presuppositions can be quite time-bound and related to contingent features of the space of possibility that seems open to us. And so the question here is really how we should check ourselves to achieve the right kind of temporal and perspectival humility in our contributions to human life, and how we should balance writing for urgent issues that are pressing now versus writing for a longer term audience. And Gina, maybe you would start us out on this one.
Sorry, had to reset the mute thing. Yeah, so I think a lot about this because a lot of the writing process for public audiences is about relating what you want to say to contingent facts of the moment that are right in the front of the mind of your present day audience, but will be completely obscure to people 50 years from now, or possibly 2 years from now. Sometimes I'm writing about something that's in the news right now, and actually I'll go back and look at my own archive from five years ago, and I can't quite remember what that was. And yeah, because it's things flash through discussion, especially it feels like these days that the news cycle, it turns over so quickly. And I was struck by this recently, thinking about this example. I sometimes teach students Susan Stebbing's book, Thinking to Some Purpose. It's a 1939 book that's basically a kind of applied epistemology, but also political philosophy. It's really interesting, a really interesting book. I mean, and she very deliberately wrote for a general audience. And so there's a lot of examples. She uses a lot of text examples from politicians' speeches and newspaper accounts, but it's referring to political events of the 1930s and 1920s. So there's some discussion of like British policy regarding arms shipments into the Spanish Civil War, but it's referred to in these jargony terms that the reader is supposed to know, but I only sort of got what was going on. Or there were examples of like 1920s arms control treaty negotiations. And again, it seems like she thinks that a general reader would know exactly what she was referring to, but 100 years on, I obviously don't. And so I as I was reading that and talking to my students about it, I'm realizing that, you know, that's only a century on. The example she's giving will be completely lost a little bit longer in the future. And so everything that I'm doing that involves talking about present day political events has a similar expiration date. I just find it discouraging sometimes because I'm often using the contingent facts of the moment as a springboard to a broader point that may or may not be eternal, but is not supposed to have a 2-year expiration date. And so it is discouraging to imagine that, you know, that if somehow one of my columns gets picked up on some future digital reading platform, they won't have newspapers or books in the future, but it's some digital reading platform, the person reading it just gives up fairly quickly because I'm referring to something Donald Trump said in March of 2025, and no one remembers who Donald Trump is by that point. I don't know. I don't have very clear responses to this, except that I do sometimes get caught up and just think, why am I consigning this point I want to make to a venue that it's going to disappear? And I have to fight that thought to be able to make the arguments. I'm especially curious what the other panelists think about this problem.
Jen?
Sure. I guess maybe part of it is that we engage in different modes, right? You odd when you're teaching to think this lecture should be for all time. You're just trying to reach the student where they are, right? And so I do think when you're writing journal articles, though, or a book or something, you do get into this mode of wanting to make sure it's not too tied to the contingent circumstances of the moment. So I wonder if they're just these different modes. And I think sometimes maybe as philosophers, we get into the idea like, I said this once, I can't say it again. But I think if you're saying it into different audiences and different venues, it can be totally fine to say the thing in this timeless, way in, I don't know, a journal article and a point in the venues that you write in, Gina. And I guess I'm not sure if I don't feel as like too much angst about this, but maybe I should. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think this is back to sort of one of the ways in which we're humanists, I think. I mean, so I think it's still worth reading Aristotle. I mean, I don't know, I would have liked Aristotle. For one thing, as we said in the pre-conversation, I mean, he had assumptions about gender and enslavement and so on that are sort of, you wouldn't know, if you met a modern person who had those assumptions, you wouldn't know where to begin the conversation. You'd think, oh, I'm so remote from you that I don't know how we can, whether we can ever approach one another. On the other hand, when he says things about friendship, I think, yeah, he's right. Friendship is an important part of a good life. And furthermore, it's for some of the reasons he says. So, or another example we discussed a little bit earlier, before this conversation began in public, is the ways in which Rawls's theory of justice, which I think will be read, for a while longer. I think it's still being read, and I think it's worth reading. Is very embedded, as he eventually, I think, himself came to see more clearly, in a particular moment in American liberalism, and the idea that the difference principle, which is sort of a plausible principle for liberalism at that time, would have struck Hobhouse in the early 20th century as very bizarre, I think, another person who wrote books about liberalism a generation or two earlier, because that part of liberalism is the product of social processes that essentially took place after the Great Depression in the United States and in Western Europe. And now, I think that's good. I mean, I think that it's good that we now think that part of the job of society is to make sure that everybody lives above a certain material baseline. But I mean, that isn't Rawls's thought. That's sufficientarian thought. But I think everybody now has that sort of sufficientarian thought as a minimum, as a sort of baseline. But look, the egalitarian thought would have seemed preposterous to some of the earlier people in the liberal tradition. Locke wasn't an egalitarian. It would have made no sense in a way for him to be a utilitarian, an egalitarian, given the society he lived in. He was the secretary to an important earl, who could do things like start a colony in the Americas. And not by consulting anybody, but just by deciding that that's what he was going to do. So I think it's the balance between recognizing that one is a historically situated person, and that what's important is relative to one's situation. So of course that changes because of the ways in which society and technology change, but still feeling, and this is the humanist in me, that because I can gain from conversations with Hume or Locke or Aristotle, there are things that last. I get, when I need consoling, I read Montaigne probably more than any modern person. And the difficulties of his times are completely different from the difficulties of our times.
The tricky
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Gina.
Well, I guess wanted to say the tricky thing for me is I'm not worried so much about the fact that the substantive points change over time. That's true about parts of philosophy for sure. But what worries me more is that even if the substantive points, even if the actual point you're making is just as viable and interesting 100, 500 years from now. My worry is about the contingent access points of references to culture, politics, technology, etc. This is why the thing about stepping bothered me so much, because I think the basic point she's making about epistemology and democracy are just as relevant today, and in some ways more relevant today. But I was having trouble following because the examples are so firmly embedded. And she's doing great. She's 1939. She's writing in this way that's great for an ordinary reader in 1939. But for me, very hard to follow because there's a bunch of factual presuppositions I just know nothing about. And so I think that's what bothered me. I mean, the more I think about it, I suppose part of the job of the scholar is to do the work, to go back and read the old text. So part of what I had to do with stepping was go and just read some of the historical background to understand what on earth she was talking about. Most people won't do that. And so there is an interesting way in which the work of future public philosophers will be partly to be able to provide that kind of temporal bridge to the things that we are writing now that are unavoidably embedded in the contingency of our historical time. So somebody's going to have to go and read some, I don't know, future version of Wikipedia article about who Donald Trump was in order to be able to interpret some of what people are saying today. And that's, I don't know, yeah.
That strikes me as consoling because it means there'll always be work for the philosophers because while the sort of the as it were universal and necessary points will have to be connected to contingent and relative points always. Even as you said, with someone like Stebbing, who was, that's only less than 100 years ago, and so there's place for additions. The examples on liberty include things like the Corn Laws that, fortunately, most contemporary readers will probably at least Google the Corn Laws if they don't know what it's about. And but in the past, you needed a note that said what the Corn Laws were, unless you were living in Mill's time, and why agitating against the Corn Laws would lead someone to want to burn down a building, which is the the abstract point is about causing serious harm by saying things. But I think that should be connected in every generation to the ways in which one can cause, in your generation, terrible harm by saying things. And in our generation, for example, one way of causing harm by saying terrible things is by joining a mob on the internet to persecute someone who, even if they're wrong, that certainly doesn't deserve persecution for being wrong. And so in that, and again, Mill wouldn't understand that. Mill wouldn't understand how a regular person in a basement somewhere could cause someone elsewhere to lose their job by circulating or by beginning a process that produces a viral attack on somebody. So, and maybe in 100 years we'll have solved that problem, and people will find it puzzling that we made such a mess of it.
Yeah.
I was just gonna add, I think sometimes the fact that philosophers are responding to contingent things that are happening at the time is actually even more makes what they're saying sometimes even more relevant. Like I've been thinking a lot about Hobbes recently, reading, going back and rereading Hobbes and learning more about that period, and the fact that it's resonant with now in some ways, that like I don't read him as saying these abstract universal things necessarily, but actually trying to solve a problem that he was faced with at the time, in a way makes it even feel more relevant, because it feels like this is in some ways a similar time with a similar kind of problem. And so going back to someone that was feeling that kind of insecurity and instability, like knowing that is actually makes it feel even more relevant rather than less relevant.
Yes,
I totally feel that way about Montaigne, and like Anthony, I read Montaigne for consolation. That I decided that my Montaigne project was the part of my philosophical life I was going to keep alive when I went into the dean's office, because I knew I would hear terrible things in the dean's office, and I wanted to have consolation for that. And at least it wasn't going to be, religious war. But I do think that, the Rawls point that Anthony makes shows that it's really important at any given time that the historical lessons that people learned about deep philosophical level problems from the experiences that they went through at that time get encapsulated and preserved and carried forward in the culture so that people can make that kind of conceptual progress. And that leads us more to the fact that we live ourselves in a perhaps crisis-filled present moment right around today's date, February 22nd, 2025. It looks like there are lots of things of special urgency and potential crisis that are happening to us, partly for our own enterprise as academics, but also for the wider society. And so I guess one question I have for the panel is, what do you guys think philosophers and philosophy can bring to the table to help our society navigate moments like this of change and potential crisis and potential renegotiation of the social contract?
Well, I'll start with the point that Jen made about Hobbes, which is that, I mean, these things have happened before. I mean, I'm of the party that thinks we should wait to see how much of a crisis we're in. I'm not yet convinced that things are as existential as some of my friends seem to think. This is being recorded, so I hope I don't regret saying that. I'd be very glad if I'm right. But if I'm wrong, we will find, I think, help in thinking about these things. You talked about the possibility of a kind of renegotiation of the social contract. Well, people like Hobbes thought about social contracts in the context of a society, in his case, that had just was going through a civil war, a war of religion, but the divisions in that war were between kinds of Christianity, and in a way, that's, to the extent that our society is divided, it's divided, as it were, within a certain Western paradigm. We're not, it's not like, as it were, a division between Buddhism and Confucianism or something. Well, those are rather closer than I meant to suggest. So Buddhism and Islam, say. So I think we can. I mean, one thing I think is we can do the things we do in our critical reasoning classes, which is remind people that even when things are difficult and people are very upset with one another, careful thinking might help, and that not just going along with every. I mean, I believe that I'll just express my own view about this, which is I believe that what Donald Trump did in closing down our activities in our aid activities was monstrously wrong, because I believe it will lead to the death of many people who would otherwise not have died. But you mustn't misrepresent what's actually happened. So some of those functions will be transferred to the State Department. Not all of it will disappear. I think it's likely that the AIDS prevention programs, which have been enormously successful and saved tens of thousands of lives in Africa, will probably go on under, and so on. So you don't want to, you want to say, look, it's important to get the facts, not to circulate misrepresentations of the facts. I heard somebody, a very responsible person, head of a foundation, at dinner, suggest that Donald Trump had proposed sanctions against South Africa. Well, but that's not true. I mean, of course, South Africa was harmed by these changes in our aid policy, but it wasn't sanctions. So I think we need to remind people that in order to decide what to do, you should try and get as good a grip on the actual facts as you can and not get those wrong. That you should not assume the worst just because you don't like somebody's policies, even the ones you understand, and so on. That we should try and maintain a sense of look, if these are issues that citizens are going to talk about together, let's not demonize one another. Let's not, and so on. Let's try and focus on the things that matter for getting it right. That is, each of us coming to our own judgment about what the right thing is, but also getting to points of agreement. One of the things about our current polarization, and this is a this is this is a sociology point, but it's a sociology point that's best made by thinking about it in the way that philosophers do. Is that what's going on right now in our political divisions is an identitarian division rather than a policy division. The divisions between the right and the left, between Republicans and Democrats in our country, are actually, very few of them are centrally because one side has one policy view and the other side has a very different policy view. I don't think that's the right way to understand what's going on. It's more like, actually, I think it's more like racial polarization was in our past. It's not that as it were, white people didn't like black people because they disagreed with them or because they were doing things they didn't want them to do. They disliked them, and then they made negative judgments about the things they were doing, in a way. And that's too simple a picture. But my point is that our current polarization, you can because it's so intense. We, especially intellectuals, think, oh, it must be because there's a deep disagreement about values or a deep disagreement about. I don't think that's. I think a lot of it is not like that, and a lot of it is things like resentment and so on, which are attitudes, but they're not, as it were, beliefs. So anyway, I think we should be trying to use the tools, including the tools that the sociologists give us, to think about these things and to try and raise the light and lower the heat, because we think that that's how the best thinking occurs. That's one of our commitments, I think, as philosophers.
Gina, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I think one thing we can do is we can be a kind of proxy attention filter for other people. And this is really responsive to the contingent facts of the current political situation. The Trump administration is doing this thing that Steve Bannon once referred to as flooding the zone with shit. And it actually predates Bannon. It goes back to the Putin regime, that this is what Putin's been doing for more than 20 years in Russia. Basically, just do a lot of things at once, say a lot of things at once, which aren't even necessarily mutually consistent, just to distract attention. And it's more intense now that the Trump administration can put executive orders behind these things, some of which will never actually have the force of law. But the point is, so much is happening. Now traditional journalists kind of have to follow the bouncing ball. The 24-hour news cycle, the ratings chase, all of that forces them to chase after the latest provocation. And basically that means they have to assist this intentional strategy of confusing the public about what's going on. And we don't have to do that. We can exercise discretion about what actually matters. And so I obviously we'll disagree about which things really matter among all the things happening, but I do think that's an obligation we have. So this sometimes this really matters. So I'm talking to other academics who want to write for general audiences. I'll say things like, we have an obligation to not chase after the exciting, provocative, bizarre thing that such and such public figure did, because it doesn't really matter, even though it will get you attention, even though it might get your thing to go viral or whatever. We specifically, as scholars, have an obligation to not do that, even though mainstream journalists might, and maybe they should do that because that's part of their job, but we should not. And so that means we can act as a kind of proxy attention filter to say, like, this is something that actually does matter, pay attention to this thing. And by not talking about the things that don't matter, we can hopefully play some role in filtering out all of the nonsense that's meant to be covered for the things that do matter.
I'm gonna maybe disagree. Not generally, I think, with the tenor of like, I agree with Gina. But I do think it is this kind of fundamental moment of like real political change. I think it's not just happening in the United States. I think people are dissatisfied with the social contract we've had and the terms of it. And I guess I want to flip the question. I want to say it's our job as philosophers to think about not just being like, well, if we explain Rawls really well, people would come to see that like they really don't disagree. There's like the liberal egalitarian core. I think it is the kind of moment that leads to new ideas, I would hope, and to like new thoughts about what our social contract should be. And so I think it should be, in a perhaps dark way, an exciting moment for us in being kind of galvanized to get a little bit out of the, we've had these ideas about what equality is, what liberty is, how you balance the two, blah, blah, blah. Like we have a kind of consensus with some disagreement, I think, among a core of philosophers to think about this stuff and think, well, actually, maybe what we're hearing is this doesn't work anymore. Like, we need new ideas. We need things that will, ideas that will actually speak to the needs that people are expressing and the ways in which they feel like their needs have been ignored. And I don't know what will come of it, but I guess part of me, and my soul dark, is excited that new things will have to come of it, I think.
I mean, I don't disagree that I mean, I sort of feel that the conversation about what's happening now is not really just a philosopher's conversation, obviously. And so what we can put into the conversation are new ideas, if we have them, about our social arrangements that help to respond to the clear dissatisfaction with what's going on that's been expressed by a lot of people in a lot of places, often. And so there is you're right, there's a transnational, so there's a kind of transnational skepticism about, I would say, the competence of elites. That's one thing, that the populism in Hungary and India and Brazil has with, and France has with the United States, a kind of, and we train those elites in our country. They come through our classes, and if they're getting something like this badly wrong, I don't mean we philosophers, I mean we the university, but we're part of it. And if we aren't, if that elite failure, which I have been myself feeling since long before Donald Trump came along, if that elite failure is a failure, as I judge it to be, then that one of the kinds of person that ought to be thinking about it is the social scientist, but another kind of person is the philosophers, who ought to be thinking, what is it about the way we run our institutions that has led many people to feel, I believe rightly, that the system isn't attentive in the way that it should be to the things that matter to them. Now, I think part of the task of politicians is not just to follow what people think matters to them, but to try and create a discussion about what does really matter, and then to focus on that. So I'm not saying that people should just follow this the populist anxiety and sort of agree with everything in it, but it is a sign of failure, it seems to me, that people that part of the voting public in these many places is alienated from the elites, and these elites, insofar as they have a philosophy, they got it from us, and also from the media and various other places, and so I think we should be rethinking. I mean, this connects with a point about the sort of long haul and the connection between the universal and the contingent. I think that one way I think about moral sort of epistemology is that we sort of deepen our understanding of certain ideas historically. When people talked about equality in the French Revolution, they were worried about the enormous difference in life prospects between aristocrats and everybody else. But that was the beginning of our understanding of what was wrong with inequality. And then gradually, very soon, it's about slaves, it's about women, who were not at the focus of attention in the slogans of the French Revolution. But once you sort of get the idea of looking for the badness of inequalities, and then by the 1960s, it's gay people and a rethinking of our relation to the indigenous populations of the people who were here before the Europeans arrived and so on. And so we have this sort of historically developing understanding of deepening, I would say, of our social understanding of what equality can be. And in this moment, I think, is a moment when we might come to see new things of the sort that were new when when the subjection of women was written, where the people hadn't thought that very much before. So I agree, it's an exciting time if we can use it to advance up, to deepen our understanding. And that would be useful, right? I mean, it's not just that, so the rewards, of course, the rewards would be intellectual, but they wouldn't just be intellectual. They might help us move towards new consensus. I mean, so one of the things that's sort of intensely annoying to me about public discourse in this country, in the United States, not in Canada, is that it is the use of socialism as a completely undigested slogan word with no substantive content, by at least when it's used critically. And I think one of the things we can do is try and slow down those conversations and disconnect the sort of rhetorical use of these words from the substantive questions that are at stake when you decide what socialism might be and whether it's a good idea or not.
Right. Before we open it up to the audience, so given that there might be this possibility of exciting theoretical, and not just theoretical, but also pragmatic and practical advance, before we open it up to the audience, I also wanted to get the panel's reflections on how things might go wrong for public philosophizing as we try to take advantage of this exciting time. So going all the way back to Plato, of course, it's manifest that things don't always turn out right when the philosopher gets engaged with the polis. And as we mentioned in the pre-conversation, Pol Pot was a great reader of philosophy, and so was Heidegger, in his case, not just a reader. So can we say anything about what makes things go wrong when they do? What kinds of correction or repair we might need to be alive to in advance as we start out on this exciting project, so that if things start to go wrong, we can try to fix? And what do you all think is the right kind of balance between our contributing characteristic philosophical expertise, more or less in a one-way sending mode, versus a more dialogical relationship of listening, as Jen was putting it early in the conversation, and responding to our fellow citizens? And how does that balance relate to the more negative or destructive episodes in the history of philosophies trying to play a positive civic role? So, Jen, do you want to start with anything about
like
what
a
things
softball there,
wrong?
Lanier. Well, one thing that it made me think about is that even at this current moment, right, there are people who are responding and advancing philosophies, really. They're just not people that we would recognize as philosophers within the academy, in terms of these like tech people with their, I don't know, views about like what the future looks like and what government should be doing. And so in some ways they are thinking philosophically and trying to promote certain philosophical views. And it strikes me, I don't know what to make of that. If that itself is, we should say, like, what can go wrong when you do philosophy in a particular way, or if in some ways we went wrong by not engaging more more with the public and like with civic life before, in a way that allowed I don't know if allowed, but that maybe created vacuums that other people are filling, you know? I'm not sure. I'm kind of two minds about that, but there is a lot of philosophy that happens that influences people's lives, people's decisions about what political party to be aligned with, about what kind of life to lead, that are, being done by a public that's not trained in the way that we are. Is that what can go wrong? I'm not sure. I guess I'll just put it out there for other people to think about that.
I mean, I think that one of the ways in which it can go wrong is to lose track of what I think of as a kind of pragmatist insight, which is that when you are using words and ideas to advance public life and public understanding, that is something you're doing, and therefore the test of the ideas is, are they helping to make things better or worse? The example of this that strikes me is so I've written a certain amount about the history of Pan-Africanism and about Black nationalism more generally. And one unhelpful way in which intellectuals have participated in that kind of movement is by insisting on the incorrectness of various views about various topics, like the science of race or something. And I think that there's a right and a wrong moment to think about those things. And when you're trying to organize a civil rights movement, fussing about exactly how you define race is just a sign that you're not on board with the serious project. So I think one way, there's a kind of, as it were, obsession with, you might call it alethomania, an obsession with just getting everything right, getting all the truths, rather than with advancing, goodness and justice and beauty and all those other things. So, and I think one can see that in a way, what Pol Pot was kind of a theorist of a certain kind of view of what a perfect society was, and he was willing to kill lots of people in order to achieve it. And I think if he'd been a little less convinced that he had the truth about things, and a little bit more concerned about what the effect was of the tools, intellectual tools he was using, he or if others had recognized this, there would have been less of that. And I think you could make a similar point about some of the Nazi theorists, that they did actually believe this weird stuff, but it would have been better if they'd been more skeptical about some of their own ideas and more attentive to what the effect was of bringing ideas out into the world. I wrote a book called As If, part of whose point, which is Idealization and Ideals, was its subtitle, and part of its point was that you need to adopt the level of precision appropriate to the subject, as Aristotle said. And too much fiddling about, people who are too obsessed with just getting it right in this intellectually are often people who are not very helpful in getting it right morally or politically. So I think that's a general point about one way. It's not the only way in which it can go wrong, but I think that is one way in which intellectuals can make things worse. It's by not being sufficiently attentive to what their role is and what the role of ideas is in making life better.
I'd add one more, perhaps unexpected direction this can happen. It has to do with the way in which philosophical thought experiments can be like a kind of earworm for the mind, where it just gets caught. People get caught with a hook, and then they can get out of the context that it was originally intended by philosophers. And so the example to think about here are thought experiments that are meant to motivate external world skepticism, or at least to think about the epistemology. And so I'm thinking about like Cartesian thought experiments about evil demons and dreams, all the way through brain and vat scenarios and through Nozick's experience machine. That there's a line from that to the Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom's argument in his simulation argument from 20 years ago now, where he argues that there's mathematical reason to think that most likely we right now live inside of a computer simulation put on by some highly advanced future civilization. All of this is just bits and bytes and so forth. And that's a very hooky way of putting it. one of the people who has said very publicly that he believes Bostrom's argument is Elon Musk. Musk has said so publicly that he thinks most likely the argument is correct. So in other words, Musk has said publicly that he thinks most likely we are all living in a computer simulation right now. That is the richest person on the planet, and at the moment, one of the most politically powerful persons on the planet, thinks this is a simulation. And I genuinely believe that some of the choices Elon Musk makes are conditioned by that belief. And that's a really striking fact. I don't know what to do with this. I'm not saying that Bostrom and Nozick and Descartes should have held their tongues because of this, but what it does mean that what seems initially like for Descartes, what's really he's not seriously taking well, actually, sorry, I don't want to firmly attribute to Descartes. Nozick is certainly not imagining that he's an experience machine right now. It's meant to be a thought experiment that's meant to guide an abstract logical question. And yet the thought experiments escape the original context and end up elsewhere. And so I don't know what to do with that, except that we have some collective responsibility to follow along after them past their original context and re-add that context to public uses of the ideas.
When my first teaching job was at the University of Ghana, and I was asked to teach intro epistemology, so we ended up talking about the evil demon. And a group of students, after the lecture in which I introduced the idea, took me outside and they said, "We just want to be sure about one thing. You don't actually think that there's an evil demon." And that was a good question in a way. It was a question about what the role was of this idea, and I think that people can take ideas off outside the context in which they're useful. And the same is true, I think, with certain ideas in sort of thought experiments in moral philosophy, like the trolley thing, which I mean, it has its uses to make a point, but it ends up, I think, in the end, sort of too much of that leads you away from what's actually genuinely important in moral life. One of the points about moral life is that typically God doesn't tell us what the situation is and give us a clear picture of what the decision boxes are and what the costs and benefits are of them. And so that's it's never like that. It's almost never like that. And so having a moral philosophy that told you what to do in those situations wouldn't be a great deal of use, because that's usually not our situation. So I think that's another thing to be careful of, as it's basically what Gina's saying is we invent these things and then they go out into the world. We need to be a little bit responsible about what happens with our babies when they go out into the world, and we need to so that we're put them in their harnesses when they're causing havoc in the public world, and try and sort of rein them back in. I think that's right.
Yeah, which might suggest the sort of interventions that Jen started out this segment calling for. There's been actually a good bit in the chat about some philosophical issues that are directly connected to this last part of the discussion, and I'll try to put together several questions from Naomi Sheeman and actually a few other people earlier in the chat. And the real issue that's coming from the audience is, can we say more about the way we should think about the interaction between the epistemic considerations that have about clarifying public discourse and getting to the truth about things and helping people think better and more clearly about them, which has been much emphasized throughout the discussion, but then connected to the point Antony was making about the importance of allowing pragmatic considerations to really guide the way we regulate our contributions to civic life and the way we try to modulate the effects of those contributions. And this seems to raise issues that have been discussed in the literature under the title of pragmatic encroachment, about what the basic norms are that we should be appealing to when we make these interventions into civic life as philosophers. So that's to the panel.
Okay. I mean, so we do it as citizens, and there are things that citizens owe one another, and one of them is respect, reasonable respect, and so on. And the other is to operate as much as possible in ways that treat each other as equals, and that already constrains some of what, some of at least how you should say what you should say, but maybe also some of what you should say, because there are going to be thoughts that it's back to the point about the baby escaping and you're being still responsible for it. There are going to be things that you can say, which, as it were, will be used to advance causes that you think are mistaken. And so there are reasons not to say certain things that you take to be true or roughly true, because there's no way they will help in the discussion as it's configured. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have those, you can't talk about those things with your colleagues and your friends. And if they're true and important, you may want to have to think about them and to think about how their truth affects what you should say, even if you can't say them. So I think there's always I mean, on the one hand, the respect requires that you not be manipulative, that you not address people in ways that are meant to get them to think things by way of, for example, arguments that you think are terrible, or things that you do yourself don't actually believe in the sort of Platonic manner. So that also that's a serious constraint, I think, on what you can say. I mean, it's not a defense, in other words. I mean, maybe this is just the shouting fire in a crowded cinema point, but it's not a defense of saying something into the public conversation that will have bad effects, that it's the truth. It seems to me. Every communication context is imperfect. The ideal circumstances for the reception of the very best ideas never exists. There's always background noise and ideology getting in the way. And so I think you have to take that into account as a responsible speaker, whether it's talking to your students, talking in op-eds or on Fox News or whatever. I think, but I think our duty as intellectuals is to be guided fundamentally by the desire to understand, and therefore to be very unwilling to be put in the service of misunderstanding and untruth. And if I think that saying the truth in a certain context will be unhelpful, I'd still rather not lie, even if I think lying would be helpful in that context. Not because there'll be plenty of people who are willing to do that. But that's not our job. Our job is our profession is tied to this thought that truth and understanding are really, really valuable things, and that we are in the professional service of those, and that's our specialty, as it were. I mean, that's a specialty of intellectuals, not of philosophers in particular. So that's how I think about that. So it is very. It can be difficult in times like these when you know that everything you say has the chance of being misused and abused, and so it's not just that you'll get an all caps email. it's that you may actually end up having the effect of something happening in the political world that is the very opposite of what it is that you wanted to happen. I'm feeling like this right now about what one should say about sort of democracy, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, it's hard to figure out what it's helpful to say about what's sort of good and bad in those practices at a time when the people who are against what's good about them are going to use any concession you make as a reason to abandon the good parts. But of course, as an intellectual, you can see that there can be abuses in the name of very good ideas.
Gina, Jen, do you, in your efforts to engage in public philosophizing, do you have a sense of where you base yourself and how you connect and relate the epistemic and the pragmatic values to each other?
I mean, this is informed by me, for me, directly by philosophical views. I'll argue for some unorthodox philosophical views. I think epistemic normativity is fundamentally social. There is no such thing as epistemic normativity outside of social normative context. And that's the unorthodox controversial thesis. But if you think that's true, which I do, then the line between the pragmatic and the epistemic is a bit mushier. And so what I happen to think is that a lot of what we think of as pragmatic effects on pragmatic factors and how we decide when we decide to claim knowledge and such are actually really complicated and multi-textured, multi-variable ways of being held mutually accountable. And it's that mutual accountability that generates epistemic normativity. That's my substantive philosophical view. If you have that view, then your relationship to a particular audience changes. The weighing of those pragmatic and epistemic factors. And so when I'm speaking to a very general audience, if I'm writing for a very general audience, in a certain sense, I'm actually more accountable than if I'm writing just for other academics. Other academics share a whole lot of assumptions and will let me get away with making a whole bunch of claims that are just background to the discipline or background to the way it is to be an academic. But with a very broad audience, I'm actually even more broadly accountable to justify some of the fundamental presuppositions of the epistemic background of what I'm doing. And so I actually find that if you have my view about epistemic normativity, that actually is a bit bracing, because it actually makes me feel more accountable to am I willing to be held to what I said, and that at least for the kind of epistemic normative view I have is really the security for truth. That's anyway, so that was a long-winded way of saying maybe surprisingly you can reject the framing of an opposition between pragmatic factors and epistemic factors, which I tend to, and yet end up actually insisting that truth is even more important than it might have seemed. And that happens to be my view.
Yeah, I guess I think that part of it might also involve just projecting the idea that we have a lot of truth to say, not to be too Socratic about it, but I think often what you're trying to do is get people to think about certain questions. And like sometimes these thought experiments are provocations to get people to think about certain questions. But then the intellectual autonomy is on the hearer, right? To like think, and I still think, you know, a lot of what Anthony said about context is really important. Like you're not, you know, I think about this with my kid. Like I'm not gonna, some conversation, she'll ask a question or want to have a conversation. We don't have time, literally, right? To really talk through it in the 5 minutes before she gets on the bus. So I say, let's talk about it at some other time, because if I just throw something out there and I'm not there to continue having the conversation, it could go really, you know, she could walk away with all sorts of ideas. So I think if you are in a position to have the genuine dialogue with someone, there's very little that in my mind can't be said. It's just that there are situations, as Anthony and Gina pointed out, that are like where we're not really going to engage in a real inquiry together. And so then you have to tread with a lot of care about what you bring up, because that kind of inquiry is being blocked off by features of the context.
So there was another question that actually picked up on this set of ideas about the imperfect communicative contexts that we might be in. And this person connected it to how we're dealing with deep disagreements on these fundamental social questions, which came up several times in the conversation. So I'm just going to read out this question. The questioner says, how do we deal with deep disagreement on fundamental social questions, for example, on gender roles, given the brevity and superficiality of modern communication techniques used by most people? Concretely, what can I do to initiate reflection in a person who does not think it's worth engaging with, quote, some woke philosophy student?
Well, conversation is an activity between consenting adults, and and also sometimes with children, but it's more complicated with children. I mean, whether they're consenting, so the answer is, I mean, some people you can't have a conversation about these sorts of things with because they're not in the business of conversation. They're not, as Hume would have said, conversable. So, but I think you can draw people into conversation, even people who at the beginning are not interested in it. And the main way you do that is by is two things. One is listening, and the other is talking about something else. If you have a conversible relationship with someone, someone with whom you disagree deeply, you can get around to the disagreeables, the disagreements subjects, but only because you've already built a talking relationship. I learnt this as a child because when my grandmother got older, she moved into a cottage next door to her bigger house, and she sold her house to a very, very right-wing member of the English Parliament, who became a very good friend. And I had the experience as a teenager of knowing and liking someone, knowing him so well that I went to his college at Cambridge because it was his college, and because he took me there to see it, all the way across England. And just thinking he was wrong about absolutely everything important. On the drive back from my first visit to my college, or his college, our college, I spent several hours trying to persuade him not to vote for the reintroduction of capital punishment in England. And I thought I remembered this right, but I checked recently. I went to Hansard, the record of the English Parliament, and indeed he was the first person who spoke up in the debate in favor of reintroducing capital punishment. And so I had no impact on him at all. If I may even have made him more firm in his bad habits. But he taught me to fish, trout fish, and so on, and I liked him. And I think it was possible for us to have that long conversation in which we might have changed each other's minds because there were all these other things in the background. Now, you cannot build that kind of relationship with all your fellow citizens. And it used to be that, and I think this was what the founders may have imagined would happen in Washington. It used to be that you came to Washington and you became sort of friends with these people who were, the founders didn't think there would be parties, or they hoped there wouldn't be parties, but you would come from your place, but you would become friends with these people, and then you would, as it were, deliberate on behalf of the people you represented, but as friends, as people who knew one another, and who therefore trusted one another and gave each other the kind of respect that you give to people that I gave to this guy, even though I thought he was wrong. One of the things that's gone wrong, I believe, in our politics is that has gone. I mean, it wasn't ever there 100%, but it's definitely less there than it was even when I came to this country as a young man. So, but we can do it in our own lives. It seems to me we can in our own lives when we interact with fellow citizens all the time, and some of these topics come up. And though more and more of us live in communities of people, like-minded people, we still are at least sometimes in the presence of people who have other views about these things. And I think being friends with as wide a range of people as possible, and not talking about the things we disagree about all the time, but building the relationships that make it possible for people to talk about the difficult things, that is a civic contribution. And if more of us did it, there'd be more of a reservoir of that kind of goodwill. And then people, when they heard the representatives they agree with describe a position, they'd remember that it was in conflict with the position of somebody they liked, and they'd wonder whether that person could be as badly wrong as their political representative is pretending they are. So there's a sort of whole network of civic relations that it would help to have, which would then mean that the person wasn't thinking of you as the woke philosophy student or a woke philosophy professor. They're thinking of you as Anthony, with whom I disagree, but so what? I have a friend he's a Harvard professor, actually, so he's a distinguished friend. But he grew up in a working class town in West Virginia, and he still every summer gathers with people from that town who went to primary school with him, and they all vote for Donald Trump, and they all love him, and he loves them. And I can't believe that their attitudes are the same as the attitudes of the Trump voters in that town who don't know him, because they know, they know what his views are, and they know someone who has those views, and they love him, and he loves them. And I think that it's a civic contribution to maintain relations of that sort. But it's a very micro, it's a very micro way of doing it, and I think the more I think the better way would be to have a more conversible Washington.
Right. But this,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Lanier.
I mean, this just brings back that point that that has come up so many times in the conversation, that different kinds of interventions need to be modulated to the context that is viable, and sometimes we have the context where that kind of ongoing relationship-based conversation is possible, and sometimes the bus is coming in 5 minutes, or what we have is an 800-word op-ed or something like that, and then you need to speak in the way that's appropriate for that context. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I was just thinking that Anthony's lovely example also points to the fact that sometimes, like, we have to acknowledge that there are limits to argumentation. Some people are not going to change their minds through some argument. Like, the way they're going to change their minds, and we saw this with LGBTQ movement and stuff, is through knowing people and being friends with people who have a different identity than them, or a different sexual orientation, or a different view than them. And that doesn't necessarily mean they'll change their minds completely, but it might just change if they have a very extreme view, it might modulate it, or it might nuance it, and so I think it's important to remember that, like, maybe we feel like we persuade each other through argument, but that's rare. A lot of people are persuaded by experience, by who they like, who they love, whatever, these other factors.
My mother used to say, my mother's father was a famously clever man, and my mother used to say to me as a child, especially as a teenager, you think that when you win the argument, you've persuaded people, but what's going on is different. You're like your grandfather. They walk away from him thinking, what hit me? You haven't persuaded anyone. You've just made them upset, that you've made them feel that you have this hammer to bash them with, but it isn't actually a hammer that does its job. It's not banging in nails. It's just making a mess. So I was like that, and my mother was a wise person, and I've tried over the course of my career to become less like that. In my own work on race and racism, I found it very hard to begin with, that people just kept ignoring what seemed to me the sensible view. And I kept articulating it in various ways. And now I just accept that. I accept that our job is to make arguments. We should combine sweetness with light. We should make them in ways that will make them not upset, or even perhaps be enjoyable for the people that we're making them to. But we shouldn't expect. And in fact, I think we exaggerate the role of argument in our own business. The first paper I ever gave was about conditional logic, and David Lewis was in the audience, and he basically said, and I was arguing for a view in which certain kinds of conditionals didn't have truth conditions, and he basically said, well, that could be right, but I think we should just, it's a sort of assumption we should make that things have truth conditions. And I thought, this is a great logician, but a philosopher of language, but why? What kind of an assumption is that? We already know there are lots of structures in our language whose contribution to communication is not through changing the truth conditions of things we say. So, and just because for a couple of thousand years logicians have thought that if isn't one of them, doesn't mean they're right. We should at least entertain the possibility that it's right. So, so now, that was one of the things that made me less interested in conditional logic, was thinking, I'm not going to persuade anybody of this slightly unorthodox view that I have. Even though I read a whole book of arguments for it. So I think we shouldn't pretend that I hope I've been changed by arguments. I feel I've been changed by arguments. I was persuaded eventually that my view about conditionals was wrong, not because we should assume something about truth conditions, but because there was a good counter-argument that I thought was respectable. But I don't think we should be surprised that people don't immediately behave like Socrates' interlocutors and say, oh yes, Socrates, you're so right. Or yes, I hadn't thought of that. We don't do that as well as we maybe think we should, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe resistance to changing our minds, a kind of intellectual conservatism, actually isn't too bad, because otherwise we'd be waving in the winds, the epistemic winds all the time. There's something to be said for being a little bit grounded and not giving things up too quickly, I think. And this is one of those places where the balance between the sort of truth-related considerations and all the others is so hard, because I can think of contexts where making what I think is the best argument, I know won't persuade anybody, but I might be able to get them round to my point of view by making what I think is a terrible argument. You should never do that in philosophy.
Yeah.
But when you're talking to your citizens, it's tempting. But of course, if you have Gina's view, maybe that opposition is not one you need to worry about.
Well, no. This is where I want to jump in. I actually think set aside my meta-epistemic view. I actually think that we have a very strong obligation not to make bad arguments, even if they're persuasive.
Yes.
That we in fact have a special obligation not to do that, and we violate a really central role duty we have when we do that. And so I want to speak a little bit against the trend of the conversation so far in terms of the importance of argument. I actually think it is our job to make arguments, even if it's true that most people aren't persuaded by arguments most of the time. And the reason for this is that people are smart, and they will eventually see through it, that you were doing something else. So if you are trying to get people to a conclusion through some means other than argument, they will eventually catch on that's what you're doing, and they will rightfully resent and distrust you. And just an example of this, has to do with the academic reception of George Lakoff. I'm not blaming Lakoff here, but I am blaming a lot of academics who for the last 30 years have been working from Lakoff's use of metaphor as a kind of indirect way of going around making a logical argument, and constantly trying to find ways of framing the way everything's being described that will be more persuasive, blah 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 blah. And people have caught on. People know that's what people are doing, and like I said, once people catch on that you're trying to manipulate them through the way you frame a conversation rather than through a direct argument, they rightfully resent and distrust you, and then you are much less effective. And so this is maybe the wrong time to start a fight about it as we're coming towards the end, but I actually really strongly believe that we have a special obligation in order to preserve the social plausibility of scholarship to not make insincere arguments ever.
Yeah, I don't think I wanted to argue that I just think there's a limit to what arguments can do, and we should know that. Like, our job is not to change people's minds.
Well,
Like, I don't
but
know
wait,
that
then-
that's
wait, then
fully,
what is it?
we
Wait,
can't
sorry,
even do that.
What is it then? What is our job if it's not to change?
Well,
I mean, I think it's what you said. I think we make good arguments to get people to ask questions, and then they arrive at the conclusion they arrive at. That I can't be, my job can't be to make you think P. Like, I just don't think that's a sensible position. I
Right.
think my job
mean-
is to put forward an argument I think might be good for P, put forward like a thought experiment to get you to think about the question of whether P, we can go back and forth about that, but then at the end of the day, whether to think P is, that's up to you.
I mean, I think there's a sort of intermediate point way of putting all this, which is to say that, I mean, I think our job is to give people the tools for deciding whether P, and one of those tools is arguments that P. Another one is thinking about arguments that not P and wondering about those. And I think that's our job. Our job is to help people to get to the point where they can make up their minds. And in the course of doing that, we should make arguments. I mean, one of the problems of our society, I think, is a kind of breakdown of trust. And you don't help that problem by being untrustworthy. You know, and people tell me, I was once at a gathering of people in connection with like a conference on security and something in Europe, and they were talking about the lack of trust in institutions. And I said to them, you know, that's the wrong question. The question isn't why people don't trust institutions. It's why the institutions have demonstrated themselves to be untrustworthy, and people have recognized it, and that's why they don't trust them. So if you want to do something, don't focus on the trust, focus on trustworthiness, focus on, and I think our politicians have lost, I mean, they never had a lot of trust, but they've lost more of it recently because it's so evident, I think, to most of us that very often, and this is not a point about Republicans, this is a point about politicians, that that they don't, they're just saying stuff. They're doing what Harry Frankfurt called bullshitting.
Bullshitting. Yeah.
I mean, they aren't even pretending to be trustworthy sometimes. They're just saying things. So why on earth should we trust them? I mean, why on earth should you trust someone who's manifestly untrustworthy? And so we shouldn't do that in our business for sure. But it's just that once you have a slightly more complicated view about what it is to present the truth, there are cases where you think, am I simplifying this too much? You have to simplify it. And in a certain sense, you know, an idealization, as Wenger said, is a useful untruth. You gotta figure out, and I think the answer is that if the simplification is not manipulative, if the other party understood what you were doing, they would see that you were trying to help them, not manipulate them, then it can be okay, I would say, because that's what trustworthy people do. They don't just insist on only saying exactly the truth if you won't understand it. There's no point in giving someone the quantum theoretic description of breakfast. But if the departures from the exact truth are not motivated by the desire to manipulate it, but by the desire to help the other person understand something, then I think you are trustworthy. And so thinking about when I simplify this, when I do this, I feel this very often when I'm writing my column. I think there's a complication here. I could put it in another parenthesis and point out this and the other. And then I think, but you know, on the topic at hand, that complication is not required for most of my readers to get the point that seems right. But you are always leaving things out, and especially if your column is 1450 words and half of it is a question.
Right. Gina, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to come back on this once more about the question about whether or not our job is to change people's minds. So I definitely agree with Jen that our job is not to, you know, settle on there's some proposition P and I will get people to believe P via any means, argumentation or otherwise. That I agree, that's not our job. But I do think in another sense, literally, that is our job, is to change people's minds by providing them with conceptual tools. I mean, this is what education is, right? It's presenting information or argumentation in a way that is calibrated to affect the minds of another person. And so I do think we are doing that, and we have to do that both in teaching and in public engagement and in scholarship. And so I guess for me, what's really important is just having an attitude of responsibility towards that. This is why I'm hammering this point. I think that's why I think sincerity is so important. Using only means you can reflectively endorse as a way of changing someone's mind, because that's what makes you a credible interlocutor. But I do want to. Anyways, Jen, I'm not sure if I'm really responding to what you said.
I know. I mean, I
words
think
you
we
used.
do disagree. I just don't think education is about that.
You
I
don't
actually
about
think
change?
it's about this kind of joint inquiry with other people. And so if I go in there thinking I'm trying to actually change your mind to think X, I'm
Right,
not really open in the right way.
Right, but I said at the beginning, and I agree with you. That's not the goal. But providing people with new concepts they didn't have before is literally changing a person's mind, right? That's
Yeah, yeah, okay. I can say like giving them concepts, sure. But
yeah.
I guess there's a sense of the kind of like the sanctity of the argument, right? It just sits there and it has this authority that's
Well,
and I think at the bottom, and I guess that's what I took Anthony to bringing up with his example, that trust is very relational. And it's like exactly, I think, the problem that we think sometimes that our expertise generates trust. That is like why we're in this mess. I honestly do think that somehow like
nice.
we can present our analytic philosophy tools and put them out there. And because we're trained in the right way, you know, people need to kind of engage with them in a certain way and respect that. I don't know. I just think like the personal and the fact that we are connected to each other in certain ways. And that's such an important part of like trust. And that makes people open to engaging in the conversation with us.
But that's part of the honesty of what argumentation is. It's me saying, here's what I think is the sincere persuasive force of these points. I'm laying it in front of you, and you agree or don't. But I'm not trying to use some non-rational means to get you to believe proposition P through any means necessary. I'm pounding this point because like the tradition.
Yeah, I think we just disagree. I think like storytelling can be such a useful method to get people, for example, to consider
Right, we're not disagreeing about
a
that.
philosophical question, but it's in a way you could think of it as manipulative. I mean, Plato, right? Like there's something about storytelling that's not going through the rational means, and it's fine.
Well, is it? Well, yeah, it depends on what you're doing. I like Anthony's point, the distinction between what you're trying to do. Are you trying to manipulate a person, or are you trying to make it easier for them to access the point you're making? But we have to be super careful to self-monitor. It's very, very, very tempting, especially if you're good at it. If you're good at writing in a persuasive way, it is super tempting to elide that distinction. And so I've come around to the view that it is really important. I think Agnes Callard has argued this most directly of anybody, that really like the traditional caustic power of analytic philosophy fighting about number premises actually has a certain sort of social epistemic function of keeping us honest. And that's, I don't know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, but I'm coming to be persuaded by that.
Just to say, I mean, again, I of course we're changing minds because giving someone a concept just is giving them a new mind, a new bit of mind. But again, when we do that, it seems to me it's because we're giving them this because we think it'll be helpful in thinking about the subject matter, and not because we want them to be able to come to the right conclusion. So we're giving them a tool for coming to the right conclusion. But as you say, if the object of the exercise was just to get them to believe that P, you would use any means necessary, right? And that isn't what you're trying to do. You're trying to get them you hope that they will find the truth. You hope they'll find more of it than you have eventually. But you want to. But what motivates you to give them a tool is the thought that it'll guide them to the truth, not that it will force them to. It'll sort of somehow bring it about that they believe some particular conclusion, I think. And you want that in part because if if they're their student anyway, you're in dialogue with them, and giving them tools for that you think will be helpful for better thinking about the subject may mean that they give you a better understanding of the subject back, because once you've given them the tool, they might criticize your P. They might use the very, as Caliban says, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. There's the great moment. So you've given someone a tool, and they come back to you and say, using that tool, you said P. The tool has led me to see that not P. Those are like very exciting moments, I think, in teaching.
Indeed. So picking up on Gina's point about the time, we were supposed to, the one version of the schedule said that the thing ended 15 minutes ago, but the more public version of the schedule says that we can go to the hour. And so I've let us go on to the hour. And let's take one more question from the audience, which really picked up on Anthony's points about the joy that we take in the activity of philosophizing. And this questioner wonders if the panelists have insights about what does and what does not work in actually conveying, expressing, enacting, eliciting in various kinds of audiences that joy. So how do we get across the footlights to our students, or to a wider readership in the print case, or to a listening audience, that infectious joy in the kind of thinking that we're trying to inject into the civic space?
I mean, I can think of people who I've heard lecture who are very good at communicating that. One of them is my friend Cornel West, he used to teach. I used to run an Intro to African American Studies course at Harvard, and which invited various people in. And whenever he came in, he got them. I mean, we might have been talking about Du Bois, but he was talking about Matthew Arnold, and he was showing that it's just fun to think with these people. It's you're trying to make sense of something this guy says. It turns out there's a thought in Matthew Arnold, or in Kant, or in Dizzy Gillespie. I mean, he would bring in all kinds of things. So I think that there are people who because they do take pleasure in it, naturally communicate that pleasure just by, as you said, embodying it. But I think one of the people who made me realize got me interested in philosophy of language was a don at Cambridge called Casimir Louis, a Polish logician, who used to swoop down from the lectern with his University of Krakow, or whatever it was, gown which he wore, floating out behind him and sort of bang you on the, I mean, not in a hostile way, but he'd be so excited about what he was saying, and he would come and bang on your desk. And in his, he was slightly deaf, and so he couldn't modulate his voice very well, and he was Polish, so his English was sort of weird, and it was very exciting. And I can still remember some of the things he said. These were lectures on analyticity. So that can be very exciting. I would say, though, one thing which I sort of feel is my sort of cosmopolitan side wants to insist on, which is that not everybody will get it. Not everybody would enjoy it. I mean, there are people who enjoy other things, and our job is to, as it were, show the enjoyment, and not to make it crusty and boring and unenjoyable. But it won't work for everybody, and we should be satisfied that we've tried, and they haven't got it. There are many decent ways of living a satisfying human life, and in some of them, philosophy isn't very important.
I guess
Oh,
go ahead, Jen.
No,
Go.
I was just going to add, I think one aspect of philosophy and a lot of intellectual endeavors that I try to show students and try to get them to practice, and I think they have to do it to see the benefit, is having intellectual friendships. I think that there are people with whom you can connect that you might not connect otherwise, right? Like you're not outside of the classroom, you go to different clubs, you do different things, but you can develop that kind of intellectual friendship with if you like thinking about the same thing or thinking about similar things, about talking about that. I think that to me is one of the joys of philosophy, like having developed intellectual friendships with people who I think I might not otherwise have had friendships with, and that can be this kind of way of connecting with each other, a way of being with each other that that the being in the academy, being in the university, but I think even outside of it, you can find, and it can be such a great source of like joy and pleasure and value in your life. So that I try to do things in teaching to kind of encourage students and say, when you walk out of here, I want you to have made a friend. And really, I mean, like through thinking about whatever it is I'm teaching in the classroom, right? Because that's just a way of making a friend that's different than, I don't know, you like going to the same club or the same movie or something like that.
I'll just add one last thing, which is that having a stimulating disagreement like the one between Gina and Jen earlier in this conversation is another great way to show people how much fun it is. And with that, we are at the time, and I need to kick it back over to Amy, who can take us out. Amy.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our panelists for this discussion and great moderation. This has been just a highlight of this virtual meeting, so thank you very, very much. Please look out for a recording of this event to be posted after the conclusion of the APA Central Division meeting next week. And when it's available, we hope that you all will share it with your networks. If you enjoyed tonight's event, we hope you'll consider supporting the APA by becoming a member or making a donation. And we also hope you'll consider participating in other events that are part of the Central Division meeting, including the other public sessions. You can find information about those on the APA website, as well as about our year-round online event series, APA Live. So do check out our website for information on that. So thank you again, everyone who's been here and the panelists especially for taking the time to be part of this event, to the Kluge Center for co-sponsoring. We look forward to seeing you at future events, both online and in person. And take care. Have a great night. Thank you, everyone.